Hey, so based off my last video, I wanted to talk to you about a court case called Jacobson versus Massachusetts. And I'm just going to read it to you. That way, it's not my opinion. It's not anti-this or anti-that. And I'm going to put something right there. And there's going to be links down there to the actual case study, as well as the Supreme Court findings. So here we go. And I'm going to omit a few words here just so that YouTube doesn't try to say that I'm doing something that I'm not doing. Okay, so the is one of the greatest advancements of medical science ever, but while that represents a welcome key to finally overcoming the disease, it has also renewed questions surrounding government's involvement in our health. Confusion and debate around vaccine eligibility or vaccine passports all lead to one central question. Can the government force you to get the... Some say the answer is obviously yes, pointing to the 1905 U.S. Supreme Court decision in the case of Jacobson versus Massachusetts. However, that decision, which upheld a mandatory vaccination law by the Bay State, is an imperfect guide to resolving today's vaccination debate. First, the background on Jacobson. The case stemmed from a smallpox outbreak in New England at a time when the disease was still highly lethal. At the height of the smallpox epidemic in the late 1800s, fatality rates reached as high as 80%. And even those who were infected and recovered were left with nasty permanent scarring. Luckily for the people at the time, a smallpox vaccine was in circulation. In fact, smallpox had been the first infectious disease that scientists had beaten with a vaccine. But in response to the latest outbreak, Massachusetts officials imposed a mandatory vaccine law as a public health measure. In Cambridge, a minister named Henning Jacobson contested the state's vaccine mandate in court, arguing the law violated his constitutional rights under the Fourth Amendment. Remember that. That case would wind up in the Supreme Court, which ruled in the state's favor. In the end, the Supreme Court ruled the government could require citizens to be inoculated. And could is the optimal word. End of discussion, right? Not necessarily. It's worth probing how the current situation differs from the case that happened over a century ago. The Jacobson decision was relatively limited in scope. First, Jacobson did not say the government could hold you down and stick a needle in your arm. It said the government could, under certain circumstances, pass a law requiring you to get a vaccine or pay a $5 fine, about $150 in today's dollars. So the decision doesn't necessarily support the idea that vaccination can be legally compelled. Second, the court explicitly said that there was no evidence that the smallpox vaccines were dangerous or didn't work. At the time, smallpox vaccines had been around for 100 years and had been shown to be relatively safe and effective. Had there been questions about the safety or efficacy of a smallpox vaccine in 1905, the justices may have thought differently. Lastly, it's important to note that Jacobson establishes a reasonableness test. I'm going to say that again. Reasonableness test. Is it reasonable? Test is, in legal terms, it must meet this criteria to be legal, to meet the standard. Okay, so continuing. Government actions must be reasonable under any circumstances, and what is defined as reasonable may change based on facts. It doesn't mean that when the government has an emergency, the government suddenly has more power, and the courts must simply defer to that power. There is no word in which the government should enjoy the right to be unreasonable, even in the public health emergency. They're talking about the Constitution. This gets at the root of why we should be skeptical for those that invoke Jacobson in today's debate. Some legal experts seem to view the Jacobson decision as essential to a free pass for whatever emergency measures government officials feel are needed to combat the disease. But an emergency is not a blank check for politicians and bureaucrats to enact any law, regulation, or policy they choose. Even during an emergency, lawmakers must establish and enforce policies that balance public safety with individual rights. And they must do so by going through the proper channels while respecting our separation of powers. So, how should Americans view the current debate in light of Jacobson? Jacobson establishes that the government must provide clear evidence that what it is doing is necessary. In a transparent and accountable manner, in Jacobson, the court essentially said, quote, "We think this vaccine requirement is a pretty reasonable and narrow restriction on people's liberty in light of the circumstances," end quote. But Jacobson is not a justification for any and all restrictions on liberty, even in the context of public health emergency. So, that's the case law you're about to hear everybody spewing, and we're going to stop the video there because the third video will cover all of the crazy stuff. It's going to go to Rumble. It's going to talk about Jacobson. It's going to talk about the 6 points. It's going to talk about what we can expect and what we need to be ready for. Okay, so until then, continue to have a great day. Continue to be safe. And we'll talk to you on the next one. See you on Rumble.